So today we're going to look at two very nice early 18th century, so around the year 1700, sabers. Or are they sabers? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm here at Olympia Auctions, and that's because there's a sale coming up on the 25th and 26th of June with lots of amazing things in it. And these are two things that I've pulled out for the purposes of this video. Now, this is not the same as this, you can probably see that already, but are they both sabers? I would imagine that to a lot of people these both look like sabers. Well, this kind of is, and this kind of isn't. So let's have a look at this one first. So regular viewers of my channel will have heard the term Pallasch. Essentially, a Pallasch is kind of a backsword, kind of a straight saber. So it's usually a predominantly single-edged straight sword, and that's the important point here. So while this sword may look like a saber, and many people would describe this as a saber hilt, the blade, I'll just very carefully draw it out there, is actually long and straight. Now many people might say, oh, but isn't that a broadsword? Well, not really, no, because it's single-edged. So technically it is a backsword in English language, but they didn't have the word backsword in Germany, where this comes from. This is Saxon. And so this was termed as a palash. Now, generally speaking, the various different people could use palash. Generally speaking, we often find the palash in the hands of heavy cavalry and the curved sword in the hands of light cavalry. But that wasn't always the case, and sometimes light cavalry hussars could have a straight palash. The obvious advantage of the straight blade is it is better for thrusting. It's better for applying the point, and it also gives you a slightly longer reach because of course when you're extending the blade outwards, a straight line reaches further than a curved line. So you will hit the target sooner, very slightly sooner with a straight blade than you would do with a curved blade. Obviously the advantage of the curved blade is it has a slightly more drawing, cutting effect, and particularly on horseback that can be useful because your blade draws across and through the target and you carry on moving, whereas a straight blade could potentially jar the hand or get stuck. Anyway, this is a straight blade, but I say it's predominantly single-edged, and the reason I say that is because it does actually have a false edge on the back here. Now, that false edge can be used for cutting, particularly at the underneath of an opponent's wrist with a cut that the French would call a manchette. However, the false edge, it seems historically, is predominantly to assist the thrust through clothing and things like that. So this has a shallow fuller, and this is Saxon, as I mentioned. So we've got a simple, let's swap this over, this dates to about, in the catalogue it says 1650 to 1700, I think it's probably towards the end of that, so probably 1700 is about right. And it has a very similar hilt to what you'll see on certain later Napoleonic era, for example, sabers, and that's essentially where they get this hilt design from. This comes from Germany and Central Europe, Austro-Hungarian, and also Eastern Europe, places like Poland as well, and Russia. So we've essentially got a grip section here with a little forward angled pommel, and your hand locks into that, and it's very good for retention. So if you're on horseback and this is a cavalry weapon, that angle there is a very good way of making sure you don't lose the weapon. You'll notice, because of its date, it doesn't have a fully developed back strap or back piece as we'd see on later sabers that would come all the way down to here. Instead, it only partially comes down the back. So this is essentially like a pommel cap, and it is peened on the end there. So this sits on the end and comes down the back, but it's not the full back strap that we see on later sabers. You will also see, and we'll talk about this with the other saber in a second, or with the saber in a second, it has a crossguard with the languettes, okay? And obviously it has a knuckle bow, and the knuckle bow connects into the pommel cap. This crossguard and those languettes have ancestral elements to their design that stem back to Austro-Hungarian sabers and Polish szabla. Okay, so this design essentially of a crossguard where they have bent the crossguard up to form the knuckle bow is an evolution of earlier simple crossguards which have upper and lower languettes on them. Now, an interesting detail of these languettes is they lock into two things. Firstly, they lock into the grip here, which assists their sort of durability and stability. but also they lock into the scabbard. So if we sheath this in here, and we'll show you, very good. This is a wooden and leather covered scabbard, incidentally. So if we put it in there, you'll see that the languettes lock in here. Now, of course, that is an important feature if you're bouncing around on a horse, and these were worn by these two rings here, slung quite low down here. So the scabbard is bouncing around, and you really want it to stay in the scabbard and not go flying out. Like that blooper from Lord of the Rings, if you've seen it. So these lock the hilt into the scabbard and make it into one homogeneous thing. So good for durability, good for keeping it where it's meant to be. Another interesting detail is, and this is something which goes all the way back to Mongol swords in the 13th century, when you have a wood and leather covered scabbard like this, and it's bouncing around next to your leg or hitting the stirrups or whatever other bits of riding equipment, the wood and leather scabbards are quite prone to getting broken and damaged. So what they started to do is they started to reinforce these scabbards with additional metallic bands. First of all, just bands around here, okay, and that's what they ultimately then attach these rings to. But you'll also notice it has a strip of iron all the way around here and around the end. Now, obviously, later iron and brass scabbards don't need this because they're entirely made of metal, but with a wood scabbard, this is a really good way of, with a minimum use of metal, which is added weight and added cost, with a minimum use of metal, really making the scabbard a lot more durable. Now, let's have a look at the other one. So here is the Austro-Hungarian Saber. This is what the Polish would call a szabla, and this is in many ways an earlier design of sword. So although this actually dates to about the same as the sword we've just looked at from Saxony, this is probably about 1700, this is a type of sword which had been around since certainly throughout the 1600s, and really earlier forms of this go back even into the 1400s. Okay? So it is characterized by two very recognizable features of the hilt. A long crossguard with those languettes up and down, which we've just seen explained, so it's essentially the same design of crossguard. Here it's not turned up into a knuckle bow because this is an earlier design. And that extending pommel cap, which again we saw on the other, on the Pallasch we just looked at. So this is very characteristic of these central, okay, Saxony isn't Central European, but this is Central European design, Central and Eastern European design, of the pommel cap extending forwards. And that is really all about retaining the hand on the grip, so you're not going to lose it. But here we've got another feature. We've got a thumb ring. Now, many people are of the opinion that these thumb rings are used in assisting with the use of the false edge. So something we see in Polish and Hungarian saber fencing, or at least descriptions of it, is the use of the false edge. And if you've looked at messer techniques or dussac techniques, you will sometimes see these sort of winding techniques using the back edge to cut with. Now, I'm not against that idea. I'm not sure that it's the primary purpose of it. I think the primary purpose of these were to do with retention as a cavalry weapon on horseback. Anyway, whatever the reasons were, these thumb rings became really, really popular in the 16th century. They were still around right the way through the 17th century, and even into the 18th century in some cases. So we've got a thumb ring and we've got that projecting pommel there, which really help you retain this sword in the grip. So even if you on horseback hit something very hard, moving past it very fast, you're going to keep that sword in your grip really, really well. An interesting detail as well about those thumb rings is they actually protect the thumb quite well. Anything coming down this way tends to hit the thumb ring at least most of the time, and is more likely to at least take most of the blow, most of the energy out of the blow on that thumb ring. Why did they keep crossguards? Well, you might think, why didn't they just turn everything into a knuckle bow at this time? But it's to do with, I guess, the fencing style, personal preferences. These crossguards, because they project further forward than a knuckle bow could, because you couldn't then bend it back into a knuckle bow from there, the knuckle bow would have to come down here. They actually, by angulation, protect quite a lot of the hand. So crossguards are pretty good hand protection, and it tends to come down to, are you cutting into an incoming cut, or are you parrying? And if you're parrying, a knuckle bow tends to make more sense, whereas if you're cutting into an incoming cut, a crossguard might make more sense. You'll see this is a Saber blade, incidentally, with some nicks in the blade, so presumably being used in anger at some point. It's a fairly standard Saber blade. It's not particularly broad, it's not particularly curved, it's not particularly long. It has a shallow fuller all the way up, and it has a false edge for the last 8 inches of the blade. So it's really, this type of sword is almost the basis for later 19th century military sabers. It's got a very similar blade, very similar feel in the hand and weight and everything else. And finally, the scabbard. So scabbards sometimes get neglected, don't they? And I think it's important to give them their dues. It's got a lot of the features of the other scabbard we just looked at, which again is why I pulled these two swords out together. It has additional reinforcing bands horizontally around the wood and leather to make it stronger. And in this case, it's got double rings, top and bottom, so lots and lots of safety. So they're trying to make this wood and leather scabbard as durable and as safe as possible for the user. More reinforcing bands around there, and then we've got this reinforcing strip along the front down here, and you think about where that would be hanging when you're riding. That's going to be potentially hitting your stirrup or perhaps your spurs or just the back of your boots. And when you're on foot as well, walking around, if you're walking up steps or stairs, that's more likely to hit things there or drag along the ground. And then finally a cap on the end, which is sometimes referred to as a drag because it drags along the ground. So there we go, two swords which share many common design features. Despite initially looking quite different, they're actually very, very related swords within the evolution of swords. Although this one's a saber and this one's a palash, so one's straight and one's curved, but actually very closely related swords. One from Germany, one from Austro-Hungary. I hope that's been useful. And I hope I'll see you back on the channel soon. Remember to check out the catalogue down below. The sale's coming up on the 25th and 26th of June. And you can look at all of the wonderful things that are coming up there in the catalogue link down below. So thanks a lot to Olympia Auctions for hosting me, and thanks a lot to you for watching. Take care, folks.